This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek. And WorkWeek in the past has covered the case of Anthony Hall, who was a professor, is a retired professor now at Lethridge University in Canada. And he was involved in a struggle against a frame-up, being accused of being an anti-Semitic after a anti-Semitic graphic was put up on his website, on his Facebook website, unbeknownst to himself. And he took up a struggle against the action against him by the university. He was successful in getting his union to defend him, and after a long struggle, he got his job back. And part of that is the use of the internet to go after people who are critical of the United States, critical of imperialism, and in this case, critical of Israel. And the latest turn of developments is a website that he was part of was shut down by the FBI, closed down on the basis supposedly that he's a terrorist, and or he consorts with terrorists. And this issue of democracy, democratic rights, and the right of free speech and the right of those who are critical of the United States government and the policies of the United States is critical for people all over the world who want the ability to get information without being sanitized and censored by the FBI and the U.S. government. So welcome to WorkWeek, Anthony.
Brith Canada, which is the Canadian branch plan of the ADL, basically planted this Facebook post, this horrific, ugly Facebook post, and then went to work on a negative publicity campaign and persuaded the board of governors of my university to join the Israel lobby. And so the B'nai B'rith Canada successfully kind of intervened in the academic life and sort of shut down any notion of academic freedom or respect of the university as some sort of autonomous place where people can speak their mind about issues. You know, this Facebook post started a movement, but I was speaking with co-hosting with Kevin Barrett, False Flag Weekly News, every week for 2 years, and we do talk about imperialism and Zionism, and so I was talking about these issues, I think, in a responsible fashion, like we should do at the university, but we don't see too much critical commentary these days coming out of universities as kind of a zone, and almost as if there's some kind of a prohibition on speaking your mind and having really good open debates on subjects like, what happened in World War II, difficult questions that require some kind of protection and sense that there's safety to talk about the hard issues of our time. I didn't, although the effort was to fire me, we went to court. My faculty association won in court against the B'nai B'rith supported board of governors, and the things had become so weird at the university that it kind of became difficult to imagine going back in the classroom. I retired, but I am professor emeritus, and so lots of people are professor emeritus, but given the nature of the pounding I took, and you followed it quite closely at the time, and I appreciate that, and drew attention to it. And I was in San Francisco a couple of times at events you organized, and one of the things we did was go to Mark Zuckerberg's home, and so Mark Zuckerberg will figure in this story. So I am professor emeritus, and I 5 years ago became editor-in-chief of American Herald Tribune, which has been targeted by the Department of Justice and the FBI and Facebook and Twitter and Google and the Washington Post and the CNN. It's been kind of a repeat. Like I sort of question, why all this attention? Like, wow, this fellow in a little community that few people have heard of, Lethbridge, at a not really a famous university of Lethbridge. Why all this attention from such major sites of power? So I don't know whether to cry about it or take a bow.
Why don't you talk about what happened? Because this issue of free speech, this issue of democratic rights and the labor movement, the unions defending professors. And there's another professor, Rabab Abdul Hadi, who also had a panel which at San Francisco State University was shut down first by Zoom and then by YouTube and Facebook. And she just won a lawsuit against San Francisco State University officials who are supporting the attacks on her and not defending her academic rights or free speech rights. It seems like there's an onslaught to shut down academics, to shut down people who challenge Israel, who challenge Zionism, who challenge U.S. imperialism. And why don't you talk about how they targeted your newspaper and what they did to you in order to shut you down?
Yeah, I've met Professor Abdul Hadi at a conference in Paris, which was on Islamophobia. And I think I've met her as well in San Francisco. So I've been following that case. Her name is Abdul Hali. My name is Hall. You know, there's a sort of ethnic contrast there of sorts. I think it would be appropriate to explain that in 2014, can I start the story in 2014 when I started this, the story leading up to founding this website, American Herald Tribune. So I was invited to Tehran, to a conference in Tehran hosted by New Horizon. The host is Nader Talebzadeh, who is a big filmmaker in Iran. He grew up in the United States. He was studying film in Columbia, and he's now, you know, a major personality. He's kind of like the Walter Cronkite of Iran. He was the host of this conference. The conference was during the period when the Iranian nuclear deal was being negotiated, and the conference, it turned out, I could see was, you know, quite closely connected to that. One of the main speakers was Gareth Porter, who wrote a book called Manufactured Crisis, saying that it's kind of a fraud the way the nuclear program in Iran is being described. It was Atoms for Peace. It was a US program to get Iran going in the days of the Shah with a nuclear energy program, which they kept after the revolution in 1979. And of course, Iran has been high on the list of Israel's enemies. And remember George Bush in 2001 with a Canadian called David Frum, you know, came up with this word axis of evil. And that was Iran, North Korea, and Iran. So Iran has long been in the scopes of Israel. I started to get a new insight into this when I went to this conference, and we talked about many issues. There were dissidents from throughout North America and Europe. People like Pepe Escobar, Thierry Meysson, Wayne Madsen, lots of Medea Benjamin was there, Imran Hussein, lots of people that I'd been aware of, but to meet them, it was quite interesting. And I'd have to say that we could talk about some of the difficult issues in the various seminars that took place in Tehran in a kind of open way. It was kind of a revelation to me about how difficult it is to speak about some of these issues within North America, within the academic system of North America. And I heard, you know, people like Ken O'Keefe. I heard some, you know, quite outspoken critiques of Israel and Israel's treatment of Palestinians, which is a big issue in Iran. And you come to appreciate that there's this kind of the face-off between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Jewish state of Israel, that this tension at that level sort of radiates through the international system. And so it was really feeling like I was sort of found my way into the midst of, you know, some pretty important discussions and dialogue. When I came back to Canada, and you know, it was interesting, at the end of the conference, Abe Foxman of the Anti-Defamation League, the legendary, I guess now, Abe Foxman, he gave a press conference and called us all, the whole conference, anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers and conspiracy theorists and 9/11 truthers and such. And so it was kind of an introduction into, how these weaponized words, just once they are shot at you, they're sort of used in a set, and to be accused of one is to be accused of all of them. So when I came back, one of the things that I noticed on a Facebook site in Canada, in 2014, they said, Professor Hall is the poster boy for the end of tenure. And so the attack on me that happened in 2016, 2 years later, it was in a sense an attack not just on me, but the whole idea of tenure as a bastion of protection for the concept that professors may sometimes be required to develop interpretations that will put people ill at ease, people in power. And so there's got to be some protections for academic freedom. And so when I got back to Canada, I was contacted by a fellow. He actually said he'd like to do graduate work with me and invited me on his thesis committee in Iran. And, Canada is not the United States, but at this time, Canada also, like the United States, didn't have formal relations with Iran. That was ended by Stephen Harper in 2012. So I've been an advocate for reestablishing proper diplomatic relations with Iran. Anyway, out of our discussion, it led here and there, and out of it came the idea of American Herald Tribune. And I was invited to be the editor-in-chief of American Herald Tribune here in Alberta, Canada. And that's what happened. So it does grow out of a collaboration with a colleague in Iran. And I do feel that it's very important that there be some ability to call on voices that are not, what we hear about Iran on American television or even Canadian television is they're the biggest exporters of terrorism, and that they have to be, there has to be regime change, there has to be an invasion, they have to be destroyed, they have to be bombed. And it seemed to me that it's, perfectly fair game to advance the concept that there shouldn't be war, that we should, what would be, what interests would we be betraying if we develop more friendly relations with Iranian people? The attack.
Isn't it the case that that Israel was a major force in encouraging and pressuring the United States to bomb Iraq and go to war with Iraq?
Well, absolutely, and it really wasn't about the oil. It was about Israel.
Weapons of mass destruction, which was fraudulent.
And of course, I happen to be one of those people. I'm not too sure where you stand on Stephen, but the real lying started on 9/11, the day of 9/11, where it wasn't a 19 Saudis with box cutters, taking on the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus, military apparatus, destroying 3 towers in downtown New York, hitting the Pentagon. No, it was a concoction, and it served the interests ultimately of Israel to demonize Muslims, especially to demonize Palestinians, to demonize Iranians, to give a rationale that you can call any freedom-fighting Palestinian, you can just call him a terrorist.
Well, wasn't it the case that the United States actually organized the Mujahideen, the Muslims, to overthrow the Afghanistani government and arm them?
Absolutely.
To fight the Russian infidels at that time. The United States wanted the Muslims to fight the Russian infidels, and at some point they decided after they were done with the Russians, they'd go after the American infidels.
Yeah, and of course the CIA worked closely with Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, which was trained in in American bases, and Osama bin Laden remained a CIA agent at right through, and he was a very convenient and well created scapegoat uh, after 9/11. And it gave justification to invade many Muslim majority countries after 9/11. And it created a toxic atmosphere.
which we're still bombing all over the world. I mean, when they talk about terrorism, the United States is the biggest terrorist country in the world, with
Yeah,
drone bombers bombing Somalia, bombing all over the world, killing people, including American citizens. So the terrorists in the White House, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, have the military apparatus of the American military and the CIA at their behest to murder and terrorize people around the world. And right now, today, I think Trump has met with the Israeli Netanyahu, and they want to bomb and attack Iran before he leaves office, which could lead to another war with Iran.
yeah. So this leads into the recent couple of years. In the last couple of years, the temperature has gone up in attacking this little website that we created, American Herald Tribune. And we have hundreds of contributors from all over the world, presenting a variety of perspectives. Many of these perspectives are not supportive of Israeli-U.S. policies in let's call it Western Asia, not the Middle East, and Eurasia. Tends to be critics of that system of power and militarism. But we're all over the map on many issues. We refer to many issues, and from my perspective, I'm quite interested in maintaining some kind of collaborative relations with people I agree with within Iran. And I don't see, what it is. Are Iranians just automatically criminal people? Can you only go on American television to advance the agenda of war against Iran? Is there no voice to hear from some Iranians who are friendly to the regime? And let's hear their perspective. We used to hear the perspective of Professor Marandi from the University of Tehran. He was on BBC and ABC and all these stations, but now the idea is to cut that off. So the case against the American Herald Tribune was that the website was an instrument of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, which is defined as a terrorist organization in the United States. Once you define another country's armed forces, and it's an integrated part of the armed forces, as a terrorist organization, that's pretty much a declaration of war. And I think if you asked a lot of people, what is the U.S. Armed Forces? Is that a terrorist organization? If you ask people in Iraq, is that a terrorist organization? How many times has the United States sort of renewed its invasion of Iraq? So so this started to become a meme. And I don't know, should I tell the story of how I saw it from the growing magnitude and intensity of, could I say, U.S. deep state attacks?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a coordinated, organized effort to shut down your newspaper. Most Americans are not aware of that, but the National Security Agency, they have a campaign to basically silence any newspaper or organization that's critical of Israel and the United States. And you were one of those targets.
Yeah, and the news came out, and Gareth Porter began reporting on this in Gray Zone. And Gareth Porter, he travels to Tehran, and the conference, my first time in Tehran, and I've been there 5 or 6 times. Gareth Porter was, the speaker with presenting his book on manufactured crisis, actually looking at the data on what's actually going on with the nuclear program in in Iran and demonstrating the wrong reporting and lying taking place about that this supposed obsession to create nuclear weapons in Iran. There has been a sort of fatwa of one of the ayatollahs against developing nuclear weapons. But in any case, in 2018, I learned that the FBI was working with Google and Facebook and Twitter to kind of demonetize us, to deplatform us. And it was very clear that the FBI was behind it. So the FBI is, working with Google and Facebook. And Facebook, we know Facebook was a CIA thing from its inception. So these big tech agencies that are taking over the internet so that they can lie to us and cover up news and cover up, for instance, the laptop from hell. They don't want to report the news that came out about the supposed future president of the United States who hasn't really won the vote, but just because the news organizations can now completely censor us and lie to us to their heart's content and do not seem to respect the idea that something like the American Herald Tribune, which presents alternative perspectives, that there should be some room for it, that this is part of the game of being a democracy. This is part of what is required, that there be some latitude to actually discuss matters of public policy and matters of foreign policy. So that was in 2018.
What was that? They called it the Manhattan Project for Truth. Is that?
I haven't heard that phrase.
I mean, they're gonna make sure that people get the truth about like Pfizer, the good works of Pfizer, that criminal operation, which is paid billions of dollars for illegal drug distribution, for killing people, for firing whistleblowers who work for Pfizer.
And you've got a whole generation of young people in the United States with very high rates of autism and all kinds of chronic diseases, which seem to be connected to the vaccine industry. Anybody who wants to expose that, even if their name happens to be Robert F. Kennedy, oh no, they have to be censored and they have to be, fact checked. You started to see this fact checking, and the fact checking, the people doing the fact checking, are propagandists for particular groups and such. Anyway, it's interesting to me, these college graduates or whatever. I mean, I am a full professor at a university, and they just tell us, oh no, you can't listen to this person and that person. Never mind their credentials, never mind their publications, never mind their books or whatever. We're just saying they're conspiracy theorists. So this word conspiracy theory, takes on this meaning. So they just kept upping the ante, with the idea that there was a number of these sites based in Iran. That was the allegation. I didn't know of any of these sites, but for some reason they seem to always put special attention on American Herald Tribune. It was always singled out specifically. And, I got sort of a continuation of the same kind of things that Bene B'rith Canada was publicizing about me, conspiracy theorists, this and that, all these weaponized terms. And yes, I do look at Israel and I do take a critical stance. And I'm also kind of angry that, for instance, in the Canadian Parliament, we can't have a decent debate about Israel, that all the political parties, the Israel lobby controls all the parties, not just the governing party of Justin Trudeau, but the New Democratic Party, the left-wing party, the right-wing party. They all have the same policy on, we're friends of Israel and we don't want to look too closely at the crimes against humanity being done to Palestinians.
Well, that is the case with Trump and Biden, both. The Democratic Republican Party, they both.
Well, Well, this to me is really a crime against our countries, that we can't have on this issue. Every election, every U.S. election, you get to choose between two Israeli agents, two promoters of Zionists, and do you want this flavor or that flavor? So, we've got that very clearly. Trump is, good friends with Netanyahu and deeply into that. And so is Biden. And every election is the same. And it's no different in Canada. It's no different in France. I mean, it's an incredibly effective, powerful lobby that not only can dominate the governing parties in all these NATO countries, centered on the US, but can dominate the opposition parties. Look at what happened to Jeremy Corbyn. So these are good subjects to write about, and I like to write about these subjects. And I write about Canadian subjects, and I've been writing about COVID-19, and we get all kinds of subjects covered in American Herald Tribune. And then, lo and behold, I read in Washington Post a special article devoted to trashing American Herald Tribune. Wow, I'm reading about myself in the Washington Post, and then get this, in the CNN, they have somebody called a disinformation reporter, supposedly reporting on the issue of disinformation. Now that's kind of got to be a hilarious concept right there. The disinformation reporter for CNN, his name is Donnie O'Sullivan. So he takes a run at it. So at this point, the job of being editor-in-chief of American Herald Tribune, and I do have my friend in Iran, and we continued to collaborate, but I am the editor-in-chief. And, Donnie O'Sullivan wrote an article and never managed to get in touch with me and ask me my side of the story. And, suddenly I'm writing responses to the Washington Post and the CNN, and this is getting kind of interesting. Anyway, the Washington Post in particular emphasizes a report done by one of these, well-funded private sector intelligence agencies called FireEye. And the report that was cited was available on the internet, and I went to look at it. And it's a glossy, probably cost somebody a lot of money. They don't say who funded it. And they don't even mention the American Herald Tribune in their analysis. It's 6 sites, but there's not one single mention of American Herald Tribune in the thing that the Washington Post is using to base its assessment of American Herald Tribune. And, not only do they don't just get a reporter or a, some kind of agent to write the story, they get the editorial board to pass a motion and take a vote. And vote that, they all find, the American Herald Tribune is somehow reprehensible. And I say, okay, well, what would you expect from a bunch of Iranophobes? Like, we know the word Islamophobia, we know Arabophobia. After 9/11, there's a great deal of buildup of the idea, oh, these are dangerous people, and they're in our midst, and we should fear them.
Except when it comes to Saudi Arabia and the validity and the nobility of these kingdoms, these reactionary, racist, anti-Semitic kingdoms, then they're okay. Then they can
and of course they buy our weapons, which they then use at doing genocide against the Yemenis. And so even the Yemenis, it turns out, with Hezbollah's advice, I guess, are able to stand up to the Saudis, who aren't particularly effective. And of course, for some reason, the Saudis hate Iran, and I guess the propaganda within the American empire tries to build up this sort of animosity between the Persians. And let's remember that Iran is ancient Persia. And of course, it does have the sort of confidence that the Iranian people, the Persian people, derived from being one of the ancient sites of civilization, and at one point giving safe haven to the Jews, and they have a distinguished role in history against the Arabs, and now the Arabs through the Abraham Accords are sort of being formed into a military alliance against Iran. So we could sort of see it coming, And then suddenly there was a statement from the Department of Justice, citing the FBI. And no doubt the CIA is involved there. And of course, to me, it was very interesting. We were actually told the website was seized on November the 4th. What was going on December the 4th? Well, it seemed that Trump was ahead, and then suddenly all the vote counting died, and suddenly Biden was way ahead. And, to this day, you can't really talk about what's going on with the election and the fact that there is a real issue about, to what extent did voter fraud happen. So I'm looking at this, and, it's coming increasingly clear to me that the FBI, really is deeply implicated in organized crime. Like after the end of the mafia, is the FBI, who do they arrest? I mean, as they're busy putting all their attention on taking down American Herald Tribune, who is not being dealt with? Like, say, the laptop from hell, that the FBI was sitting in Christopher Wray's office for a year. Nothing happens about it. Like, when does anybody at the high level of US politics, or finance for that matter, when are they ever held accountable for breaking any laws? When are they investigated for anything? I mean, how many times does it come up that Hillary Clinton is implicated in, crimes, murder and such? There was a certain resonance in 2015 during the election when people said, lock her up, lock her up. So then the FBI and Mueller and Comey and they're all involved in trying to build up this image that Trump is an agent of Russia, and there's this enormous sort of perjury taking place and falsifying of evidence and everything. So the same FBI that's coming at American Herald Tribune, what are they doing within the United States and enforcing law within the United States? When does the Department of Justice deal with crime at the highest level of the United States?
Well, there's also the issue of whistleblowers in the United States. OSHA, they're federal whistleblowers who've been exposing corruption by Tom Perez, who was head of the Department of Labor under Obama, and he prevented any investigations. He apparently is untouchable. He was involved in obstruction of justice because whistleblowers who were exposing the fact that companies like Wells Fargo and Morgan Stanley and FedEx were violating the laws, were retaliating against OSHA's whistleblowers, and he covered it up for them. So the systemic corruption at the top of the government, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, continues on and on. So in
the last few days, this person called Sidney Powell sort of emerges. I don't know if you had been following her, Steve, but she was a new person to me, but she has been a prosecutor for the federal government in Texas and other places, and her history is to expose, for instance, the incredible corruption around the prosecution of Arthur Anderson and Merrill Lynch in the Enron matter. And so, you get these scapegoats. You have a scandal, and you have, the Bush administration deeply involved in Enron, and so rather than going at where the crime would lead if you were doing a proper investigation, you pick out a few scapegoats and give the appearance that you're doing something.
Well, this internecine warfare in the capitalist class. They're at war with each other. It hasn't been since the American Civil War that one capitalist politician or president would call for the jailing of another one. I mean, there is an internecine warfare going on in the capitalist class against each other. And isn't that a reflection of the decline of the U.S. empire?
Well, absolutely. This whole 2020, this incredible year of 2020, has just demonstrated that the fragility of this empire, and And of course, then this whole issue of, well, is Biden, is he on the take from China? Is he a national security threat?
Well, I would say that both Biden and Trump are implicated in financial relationships with China. I mean,
yeah,
Trump,
and the whole
Trump's daughter is
capital.
getting copyrights, and they're doing business there, and Trump's son was getting money from the Ukrainian,
Yeah,
corrupt Ukrainian billionaire. I mean, this is like business as usual. I mean, for the
well,
American capitalists, looting and privatizing and making deals financially.
but what was unusual about the emergence of China and the integration of the U.S. capitalism into this strange concoction of Chinese communism, which David Rockefeller is one of the big engineers of. He writes up the blueprint for us. Kissinger is involved. Like the whole capitalist class, there's just been so much money generated by bringing on these highly skilled, low-wage workers, and building up the industrial capacity of the United States, of China, at the huge cost to the average working people of the United States. And this must be a huge theme with your membership, and that United States really had a situation for a brief time after World War II where working people with good union jobs were kind of marginally in the middle class and could have decent, could take their family on vacations and have, decent life. And all of that was gone and squandered. And so the working people suffered, but the capitalist class and the political agents of that class have benefited enormously. It's generated so much money. And Biden, I mean, it's not like he's the only one, but it has served to sort of put a focus on this issue that, if the United States has suffered some kind of subordination under this emergent sort of capitalist power of this communist regime in China, many people in the ruling class are responsible and took their cut and took their share. And now this is coming to a kind of head. And the whole legitimacy, the whole process of, the intelligence agencies working with the media to completely dominate. It's like a takeover now. And so there is a little bit of a happy ending. I mean, it's not over, but American Herald Tribune was seized. It was no more. It was gone. And then through a whole set of circumstances, which I won't relate, it's been reborn. It's now at CA. It's not at .com. It's at a .ca. So AmericanHeraldTribune.ca, not AmericanHeraldTribune.com. And apparently the CIA gives it, or the CIA, the CA, the Canadian, the connotation for Canada.
The domain for Canada. The domain.
Yeah, the domain indicator for Canada, CA. It gives it a kind of protection where when it was .com, it didn't have. It was subject to this direct claim of jurisdiction by the Department of Justice and the FBI and the CIA, which is deeply involved in this election fraud. And I think that's one of the things that Sidney Powell, who has been quite outspoken in the past, her book License of Lies, exposing the breakdown of any kind of rule of law at the upper echelons of the U.S. power structure. And so all of this is coming to a head.
I mean, there are claims, though, that Chavez government and the Cubans were responsible for rigging the election in the United States. I mean,
well, wait a minute now. let's get the stories,
The machines, the machines.
Which has been talked about for years, and the
Yes.
people who try to bring it up are told, shut up, conspiracy theorists, go out in the hall and hold your head in shame, because we're the United States. We're the freest, most democratic people in the world. How dare you say that our elections are corrupt? But they are corrupt, and these election machines for a long time have been used, and it seems that they have been used by the CIA and other agencies to rig elections all over the world. And so that is coming out now.
Do you think the United States would rig all elections around the world? Yeah.
Yes, I do, and I think that color votes and George Soros and all the color revolutions. This is a kind of color revolution taking place in the United States right now. But let me just indicate that Dominion Voting Systems, its headquarters is in Canada. Its headquarters is in my hometown, Toronto, Canada. They've all moved out. They've taken off. You can't find them. Now, I don't find it that incredible that there is some Venezuelan connection. And I'm a leftist. I'm sort of, I'd call myself a progressive, but when I see what's going on in the United States, I don't know if I'm comfortable giving myself that name, but I looked at Hugo Chavez and the ALBA movement and the effort to break out of the Washington consensus and have some nationalism within the framework of Venezuela. And Chavez, I thought of as a person who is loved by the poor and not liked very much by the rich, because he uses the oil wealth to democratize things a bit and to give a break to the poor people. So I don't share this interpretation of Sidney Powell. However, the idea that might they rig the odd election in Venezuela, I don't see why they'd be beyond that, and I don't see why it's really an incredibly impossible thing to imagine that it does have roots in Venezuela.
Well, the United States has been involved in overthrowing 130 countries around the world.
Yeah.
It was involved, it spent $6 billion in Ukraine, overturning the Ukrainian government. It was involved in supporting Boris Yeltsin in the Russian elections. The United States was involved in Russia in keeping Boris Yeltsin in, who was their man, was Washington's man in Russia. So for the United States to talk about democracy, legitimate elections, when it's intervening with billions of dollars around the world to put in U.S. friendly governments, seems a rather strange.
And of course, there's nothing new to this. I mean, there's Chile and Allende and taking out the socialist Allende. There's Hawaii and Queen Liliuokalani, and taking out the indigenous government of Hawaii. And there's the Philippines and the Spanish-American War and the on and on and on it goes. So the United States is supposedly created in a rejection of British imperialism, but it seems it incorporated the sort of imperial spirit of the British Empire and refined it and kind of made it laissez-faire, so that there's no real legal nature to it. And the era for that is coming to an end. And of course, somehow Israel took over the British Empire and got their Balfour Declaration. And then at the end of World War II, Israel became a sovereign country, largely by paying off Truman and getting the United States in line. So this Anglo-American
and the Soviet Union.
And the Soviet Union.
Stalin and the Soviet Union backed Israel to become a state.
And this sort of revisionist Zionism, this Eretz Israel, this idea of Israel doesn't really have fixed borders. It's an expansionary project. This is right out of the U.S. History. The idea of manifest destiny and pushing westward and taking over the whole continent and basing it on religious texts and sort of Old Testament thinking that, the founders of New England did see themselves as kind of God's chosen Israelites, you know, and they're going to create a new Jerusalem. So there is a deep kindred understanding between the imperial factions who created the United States, which was a transcontinental imperial project, you know, from the beginning. And now we're seeing that being played out in the Middle East. And there's Iran, who offers a different interpretation and is, you know, is siding with people in Syria, in Yemen, who, you know, are against the expansion of this territory, and in Iraq. Actually, I find that interesting. I find that something significantly important, and I'm proud of the fact that I have some connections with people in Iran who are decent people or thoughtful people, who, you know, nuanced people. And I just reject the idea that because I know people in Iran, I have to be demonized, that somehow I'm just the dupe of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. Like, give me a break. Like, you know, anyway,
your little newspaper is such a big threat.
yeah. No,
I mean, nobody even knows about it until it's in the Washington Post. You know, a big article targeting you. I mean, like, this is the Washington Post, owns by Jeff Bezos.
Yeah.
You know, one of the richest men in the world. They have to spend time targeting a little newspaper in Lethridge, you know, as a threat to America. You know, it just,
And not only that, but the CNN and Washington Post are both particularly known as sort of CIA operative bastions, you know.
and Wolf Blitzer, working for the Israelis, he was an Israeli agent, an Israeli news person with the Israeli government, and then he works for CNN. And of course, I mean, Biden is bringing in Israeli supporters, Zionists, into his administration, who support Israel, who support Zionism, the apartheid regime, and the attack on the Palestinian people.
Yeah, that is can't be discussed. That is where our free speech comes to an end. Because if we try to discuss this, we become anti-Semites. We have to lose our jobs. We can be incarcerated. You know, if you want to have a career, a viable career in academia, in politics, in public administration, you better not say a positive word about, you know, Palestinian people and the fact that their human rights are being violated and there's a kind of genocidal assault on them. That's a forbidden subject. And the United States is, you know, no longer credible as a bastion of free speech, which is sort of basic to democracy. The United States is no longer credible as a place where you have a media. It's as bad as Pravda would have been. It's like Stasi country, like the idea that the media just bands together and says, no, you can't talk about that. You can't talk about the laptop from hell. You can't talk about the fact that the US election, the numbers are still, you know, subject to legal challenges and auditing and such. And so it's been exposed at a level that the United States just can't credibly stand up in the world as a proponent of these principles that have been so basic to the American dream.
And one of the actions of the Zionist or agenda, with support of the Democrats and Republicans, is to argue that if you're critical of Israel, that makes you anti-Semitic, and that should be illegal to be anti-Semitic. Is that also going on in Canada?
Well, what do you think, you know, was the argument against me? So to criticize Israel is to be anti-Semitic. It's interesting, you know, because Semites are essentially Arabs. I mean, it's a sort of linguistic concept. So, you know, the Palestinians are Semites, for sure. Are the Ashkenazi Jews Semites? Really? I mean, couldn't you say that the, you know, Ashkenazi dominance within Israel, including of Jews who are Arab, who are sort of second-class citizens within that Israeli structure, because it has this, you know, racist prejudice against darker-skinned people or people that, you know, don't come from supposedly so greatly civilized Europe. So, is the treatment of predominantly Ashkenazi Jews, the powerful Jews in Israel, in the United States, is that a kind of anti-Semitism towards Palestinians? It's a concept, using this word anti-Semitism, that really is no longer viable. Maybe call it Judeophobia. I mean,
Well,
that would be a better.
isn't it also the case that the Zionists were themselves involved with the Nazis, collaborating with the Nazis to arrange with the Nazis to bring Jews from Germany to Palestine? In
And
fact,
it did happen.
Adolf Eichmann was invited by the Zionists to Palestine at that time, and the Nazis struck a medal for their collaboration with the Zionists because they both have a racist ideology. And the ideology of the Nazis was the Jews didn't belong in Germany, and they supported the Zionists who said the Jews belong in Palestine, some other place other than Germany.
Yes, of course, there was a transfer agreement. There was a transfer of 60,000 people from Germany and their occupied zone to Palestine. And then there was a faction of Zionists who, couldn't see themselves aligning in any way with Britain, and kept their, preferred to keep their relations with Germany. And one of them, I think it's Yitzhak Shamir, he became prime minister of Israel. Menachem Begin, of course, is of that Jabotinsky, very militant faction that blew up the King David Hotel and murdered many.
It isn't the case that the Zionist movement is a pro-imperialist movement, and Lenny Brenner, Zionism in the Age of Dictators, talks about how the Zionist movement collaborated with imperialist countries like Germany and then with the United States and others to get Israel established as a Jewish state, as a Zionist state. So their whole history is one of collaboration with imperialism in order to justify and get their agenda going of a Zionist state beyond the borders of Israel.
And of course, this has been very difficult for Israeli propagandists or public relations people following World War II, where the former colonized people, whether they be in India or in Africa or Indochina, many of them emerge and say, well, we're going to take over our governments and become self-determining peoples. And it's in amongst all of that that Israel is taking form. And, the 1967 war targeting, expanding the boundaries of Israel into the Arab-dominated population. This is an imperial war, and it's a very different situation than the rest of the world. And so what you have is, in the General Assembly of the United Nations, you have a tremendous number of the members, the new arrivals into the category of nation states are former colonized people. And so they see in Israeli history and in the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians reflections of what they experienced under European imperialism, and now some places in the world under US imperialism. So, the UN General Assembly, these resolutions that they pass are often very, very critical of Israel and supportive of Palestinian people who are a reflection, they are the Indians. I mean, the Trail of Tears in the United States, which was to push all native people west of the Mississippi River in the era of Andrew Jackson. And it did take place in the famous Trail of Tears. My scholarly interest goes to, well, how does that lead to the Trail of Tears in Israel? A sort of Trail of Tears to displace Palestinian people and treat them as sort of alien people. There's a few who are citizens within Israel, but the people in Gaza, the people in the West Bank, there's even many people in Lebanon. I mean, there's a large sphere of Arab people who are more or less under control, or very adamantly under control of the Israeli government. And especially in Gaza, it's just a horrific situation. It's one of the ugliest, most severe cases of ongoing genocide, ongoing colonialism in the world today. And so, this history, I think, is rich history. And I as a professor of Native American Studies, this was the history that brought me along into my career, the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada, in North America, then in the Western Hemisphere, then looking at it as the global phenomena, the imperial treatment of Indigenous peoples. And that study, is well applied to the history of Israel. And, I talk about this background of theology, theological thinking, and interpretation of the Old Testament or the Torah, and how you can look at the alignment of these things. Stephen Saleta is another professor who lost his job at the University of Illinois, a Palestinian professor who was hired to become a Native American Studies professor. And that was a very potent, I think that is a potent idea. And when I think, why am I getting all this attention? I think that is the subject that is not appreciated in Israel. Drawing parallels between the treatment of Indigenous peoples in the history of North America or the Western Hemisphere, let's throw in Australia, and what's going on in Israel in the history of Israel.
Right. We're speaking with Professor Anthony Hall, who has had the experience of being targeted twice, once removed improperly as a professor at Lethridge University in Alberta. And again, his website was shut down by the FBI, which seized the website and tried to shut his newspaper down because it was critical of Israel, critical of Zionism, critical of US imperialism. You're not going to be shut down, Anthony, are you?
Well, I felt there was, quite a kind of coming up, phoenix arising from the ashes or something. Suddenly we're up and running. All the, what part of what you come to treasure a great deal are the archives in these websites, the backlog of articles, the thousands of articles. I might have dozens or hundreds of articles in the archives, but many people have their sort of legacy in these archives. So when you just make them disappear, when you just obliterate it, it's a tragic thing. And it is every bit like book burning. It is totally like book burning. And it's, it's as obnoxious as any book burning that ever happened in Europe. And to see the United States with all its potential, with all its possibilities, with all of this land and people from around the world and all the wonderful things that they could have done, but instead, no, we're going to be a war machine. We're going to be the most effective murderer in the world, and we're going to, block information and destroy any analysis which calls, our imperative, our God-given imperative, to dominate the world. We're going to destroy anybody who has a different interpretation. We're going to, get them out of their jobs. We're going to get them out of the university. Come on, the United States, has contributed a lot to the world. And, it's so disappointing to see, the possibilities of the United States or the possibilities of Canada or France or Britain, for that matter, thrown away, demeaned, undermined. And there's just no getting around the fact that the Zionist lobby, the Israel lobby, is having a very deleterious effect on our overall culture, on our ability to, treat one another with respect and dignity, to have open and fair conversations, even when we disagree. What is this Zionist insistence that we've got to, hate, we've got to, anybody who criticizes, oh, that must be hate speech, and we better shut down and stop it. And we've got all this history to draw upon that if we let this get out of hand, who knows what's going to happen? No, I intend to keep writing and commenting, and I thank you, Steve, for following my case in the past, and here we are talking about a really interesting new few chapters that have transpired recently.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with Anthony Hall, who is a retired professor at Lethridge University, and he had his site seized by the FBI with false accusations that he was an agent of Iran, of an enemy state, and he has successfully, and his supporters have successfully reestablished their site in Canada under the .ca domain. So you fought back and you're up and running again. So thanks for joining us on WorkWeek.
Thank you so much, Steve.